Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Today it's my pleasure to talk about the Forest Lawn Landscape Renewal Plan and returning the forest to forest lawn. I hope today that the methods and approach we've taken at Forest Lawn is something you all can use at your site and your work as well. So I would like to talk briefly about Forest Lawn, its history in the region and in the nation, specifically about the plan, how we came to this point in our history at Forest Lawn, and then really, again, cover these, what is tree renewal? What does that mean? And what's the tree replacement methodology we're using? And hopefully even briefly talk about the phase of the project that we're taking, which I find is equally important to the methodology. Once you have a great plan, how are you going to put it to use? So Forest Lawn, as Jason said, is a 269-acre rural cemetery in Buffalo, New York. Rural meaning we're very much a part of the rural cemetery movement. I apologize in the back if it's too small, but I just hope to show the context at which Forest Lawn falls in. They're right in between Spring Grove in 1845 and Central Park, an important landscape in America. But as many of you know, Mount Auburn Cemetery being the first rural cemetery in America in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And from there, major cities, major economic hubs decided to have their own rural cemetery for all the reasons that came along with it, the changing view on death and the concerns for public health, etc. So I just wanted to show the context for where we are in that timeline. Forest Lawn is currently 269 acres. We started out as 80 acres, founded by Charles Clark, a lawyer in Buffalo, who had visited these other famous, what have become famous cemeteries, beautiful places at these other cities. And he decided that Buffalo very much needed a rural cemetery as well. These images I'm showing are of engravings from 1855. And he purchased the land from a local family, a well-established family, the Granger family. And this very much was on the edge of town. It was a rural part of the city, outside of the city limits. For those who are coming to our workshop on Thursday, you'll see very much that today we're in the heart of Buffalo. But at the time, again, the context of where we started in 1849, it took some time to get there. And so Charles Clark had his work cut out to get people to come to his cemetery. But as you can see, even from these early images, the name Forest Lawn that Charles Clark chose was very much because of the site that he found, that he selected. It was intentionally chosen on the edge of Scajaquada Creek, a very important creek in the history of Buffalo, along with being adjacent to a number of springs. So water is a continuing theme throughout our landscape, and the creek actually runs through the middle of our landscape, something that I believe is very unique to our site. All rural cemeteries have a connection to water, topography, how they're laid out, the beauty that they're trying to encourage in nature, and Forest Lawn very much is doing that as well. Here's just an image of one of our main entrances. Again, this gate was there in 1849, but George Quirey made improvements in 1906. This is a view that I'll use throughout the presentation to show change over time on our landscape. Here's our main office, again by George Quirey, and updated by E.B. Green. I mentioned their names. You might not know them by name, but again, a major part of our history and our landscape is the built environment, not just the trees, but the built environment. And I just want to mention that to tell you more about us. We have very many famous residents, so to speak, and are home to many great pieces of art. This is a view, again, the gate is behind us, and in the distance you'll see Red Jacket. a statue, a sculpture in his honor, and we'll learn more about that particular piece later on today in a second talk. And finally, just in wrapping up our history, I had to include the Blue Sky Mausoleum. It's the only family mausoleum in the world designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was designed for the Darwin Martin family, and we feel very lucky to have it on our site. And there's a history behind all that as well. So tree renewal. What is tree renewal? How did we get here? Well, the theme returning the forest to forest lawn means we lost the forest, or it changed, or something happened. And the big thing that happened is in 2006, in October, there was a surprise snowstorm that dropped 24 inches of heavy wet snow over the course of 12 hours when all the trees still had their leaves. And forest lawn lost almost 700 individual trees in that one event. This is a picture from just a day or two after, and the snow's already gone. It was a surprise lake effect event. The sun came out, the snow melted, and we were left with all this devastation. It was all over the region, and forest lawn wasn't the only person hit with that damage. But FEMA gave lots of support in the area, but they did not give support to cemeteries. Cemeteries were specifically declined funding. So we had to clean this up. We had to be active to our families who have loved ones there and who were bringing them there. And we very much did that, but it also made us pause and think, these trees are important. How are we going to plant them back? So what we did is we went and through granting from the John R. O'Shea Foundation in Buffalo and worked with Heritage Landscapes in working out a plan. And that is what we have today, the Landscape Renewal Plan. But the damage, I just show you the plan. If anyone wants to look at it after, you feel free to take a look. But what we realized in that is that this isn't the first time that the forest landscape has changed. Here's a view. You can see Red Jacket in the distance, and this is 1905. But here's 1939, and here's 1941. So the point I want to make in telling the story of tree renewal and working in a historic landscape is it all starts with documentation. I think I'm preaching to the choir when I say that, but it's very important to remind ourselves that before we start working, we have to know what we have, what the history is, and the Landscape Renewal Plan very much does that. So this is a great image for us because you see the towering elms and you see the scale of Red Jacket to the trees, and it was majestic. Again, we're not the only landscape in the Northeast that had majestic American elm, and like many of those, we no longer have that view. This is 2011. There's Red Jacket again. So there's change. We're working in changing landscapes. How do we manage that change? How do we renew the landscape? I wanted to take a minute to talk about renewal. It's not a term that is in the 4 treatments that are widely talked about in preservation. And the Landscape Renewal Plan, with its title, I just want to say is very much like a cultural landscape report, if you're familiar with those. The plan, our plan, the Landscape Renewal Plan, has 2 parts, very similar to a Part 1 and Part 2 of a cultural landscape report, with the emphasis of our plan going to how we specifically restore the tree canopy. So we have selected restoration for the trees based on our documentation. But again, with our history, we have many designers who have come to our landscape, not Frederick Law Olmsted, but Adolf Strauch and Earnshaw and other cemetery engineers or landscape architects before they were called that. And we have that history, but we don't have a lot of specific planting plans. So what does that mean for us? Well, you go to aerials, and we very much looked at aerials. And so we are confident with this approach of restoration for trees. It's very much needed for our integrity in our landscape. But I prefer, and we chose renewal because of its really connection to plants, I think. Rejuvenation is another word. And I guess I just wanted to take a minute to say, you can get outside the box of the 4 standard treatments a little bit when you think about landscapes and plants, and especially trees. I was reminded of that when I put together this presentation, thinking about the devastation in '06, but here's '05. There's change throughout our history. So this isn't the first time it's going to happen. It will happen again. So when we think about what we want to put back, what are we going to replant with, we very much looked at what the impact the trees have in our landscape. They're not just there because of our name. They're there intentionally amongst all of the graves. And so you have to think about the views and view sheds. When you think back to that image of 1941 and towering elms and the arching cemetery drives. So we set targets based on these different characteristics, especially deciduous and evergreen. We very much have a deciduous hardwood canopy at Forest Lawn, and that came out in our study of the site. We also wanted to consider these other components because Buffalo, being in Western New York, has windstorms, ice storms, snowstorms. So as I manage the tree collection moving forward, how can I best put the best plant in the right place? Are there trees that we want to stay away from? Are there trees that aren't suited to be along the fence? I also wanted to take a minute to talk about, in working in a historic landscape and we're looking to the past, it's very much appropriate to look to the future and what's best today. We know that we shouldn't have 50% of the trees be one species, because when that happens and Dutch elm disease comes along, you no longer have 1,200 American elm towering along your streets and roads in your cemetery. You have 7. Today we have 7 of the American elm, whereas we know from an inventory we had over 1,200. So that's another change in our landscape. And when you visit today, you don't see empty spaces in all of those 1,200 sites. You see silver maple, Norway maple, and Christine Buseman. They replaced them when Dutch elms came through. But are those trees doing what the original trees and what the elms were doing? Were they the forest at Forest Lawn? When you see a roadway of Norway maple, do you feel that you're in a forest, or do you see a short, dense, invasive tree? Can we do better than that? So we've got to that point through this effort in the landscape renewal plan. I point to this 10-20-30 rule for those who might not know of it. It's a good rule of thumb. It's definitely not the only way to go, and there are some times when it's just not possible, but it's a good goal to have in thinking about your overall collection or your overall landscape. Again, for the idea of it's not if, it's when a bug or disease is going to come along. Dutch elms wasn't the first one. There was chestnut blight. And now we have Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer, and oak wilt was just discovered in Albany. So you have these very destructive forces that aren't always a 24-inch snowstorm in 12 hours. So you can only do so much, but in thinking of diversity, you can help lessen the impact. At least that's the hope. But again, I want to say, what are the implications of this 10-20-30 rule on the design intent? There are many places where this just isn't possible, that there is a clear design intent of uniformity, and uniformity is paramount. Now, within uniformity, can you go back to the characteristics of tree height, a vase-shaped tree versus a pyramidal tree? So you can get to uniformity, especially along roadways, not using the same species, but maybe even using different cultivars of the same species or different species of the same genus. So I just want to encourage you to think about these things when you're renewing your landscape. Another important part is how you'll plant them. Money and time and energy are always a factor that we all have to deal with. So you can be creative in how you implement this. And there's a difference between a bald and burlap tree and a bare root tree. If you're not familiar with bare root trees, there are certain species that do very well being planted without a root ball. A 2-inch caliper tree with a standard root ball usually weighs 200 to 300 pounds. A standard bare root tree of that same size weighs about 25 pounds. So the implications to your project are huge in terms of safety concerns or being able to, the logistics of getting them out and getting them planted. Container is something I also mentioned in terms of size. You can plant small when you're thinking of renewing your landscape. It doesn't have to be big. And studies show that if you plant a large tree and a small tree together, and they're both B and B, which takes off 90% of the roots, the smaller tree will outcompete the bigger tree in 10 years. Balled and burlap is a very invasive process to a tree in the nursery. It's growing in the nursery just fine, and then you put it in a little ball and you cut off all of its roots. Now it has to reestablish itself. So it's very enticing to go with large material, but there are implications to that. And sometimes it's appropriate, and sometimes it's not. So in working with volunteers, we're very much utilizing the bare root method. We're planting 200 and 300 trees over a day or two, all with volunteers, knowing that it's safe for them to carry that 20, 25-pound tree, and they're not wheeling around a 200, 300-pound tree trying to get it in the hole. So that's just another aspect to think of in your methodology. So for us at Forest Lawn, when we thought about the landscape as a whole and the need to get trees back in the landscape, I don't think I've mentioned, I apologize, we have about 3,500 trees today, and from our intensive study we know we need about 6,200 trees. So how do we double this canopy and restore the forest, return the forest to Forest Lawn, so to speak? And where do they go? This methodology we've broken down very much ties into the study of how our landscape has changed over time. We started at 80 acres, we're at 269 acres. When did that happen? Why did it happen? Who were the designers? And then just planting locations. So this is really driven by, is it along the cemetery drive? Is it in a section? Is it on the perimeter? So at Forest Lawn today, we're very much part of the city. And while from the beginning we wanted to be welcoming and we were out of town, even though we're in town today, we still want people to see in to our cemetery. So how we plant along the perimeter is very important. And so under each of these 3 headings, there are 3 or 4 even different headings. So this is a plan. This is a plan in the landscape renewal plan. And to zoom in on it, that list of typologies, as we call it, where trees are planted, is demonstrated. And this is just a zoomed in corner. And so when I go to these sections to think about what trees need to go here, this is one of the first places I start. Corresponding to this color-coded typology is a species list of suggested things that will work. There are certain things that will not work well in a dense interior area. There are things that are appropriate for along a formal drive that just aren't appropriate along a sectional drive. Again, it's managing change, it's recognizing the uniqueness of each place and taking the time to see how that is based on documentation so that we can get to the end result. So as we go to phasing, if you have the money and you have the time, I wouldn't even recommend doing it all at once. Because if you think again back at the pictures from 1905, 1941, and the change in the landscape, those were all planted in a short period of time. So when you think of your collection as a whole and you want diverse species, I would recommend you also attempt to have diverse age. So that in 50 years when these trees are getting to, hopefully they're prime, but the reality is, again, this study is based on street trees, but the average life of a street tree in a tree pit is only 7 years. So even though you plant an oak there, it's not going to be there 50 years from now. It's not. Now that's a street tree, and we're in a protected cemetery, and we very much want to have the best, healthiest, tallest, oldest trees in town. But every new tree has the same struggles of being established, making it through the first summer season with water, not getting hit by a lawnmower, not having a little kid rip the limb off. There are all those things that still happen in our site that happen along a street tree. So we phased it into 4 phases and only planting at most 330 trees per year over the course of 12 years. So again, we're only talking about a decade, and maybe relatively speaking, that's not a lot of time, but also given our limitations of staff and budget, this is an appropriate way for us to tackle this large task of essentially doubling our canopy in a meaningful way with volunteer planting projects to engage the community and develop more support over time. So the diversity of species, I would encourage you to also think about phasing of the planting as well. Again, this doesn't work every time. If you have a view or vista or one important road, you might want those trees to all be the same age to a certain extent. You might not want half the road to be short and half the road to be tall. But again, can you do that road together and the section differently? Just think about those options and what is appropriate for you. Here's a chart, a section of the chart about phasing. If you go down the year, you see it steps down, and there's a color difference, because also in thinking of getting the trees planted, it's also about taking care of them. So the plan also outlines a very intensive set of maintenance tasks and goals that in a perfect world, for the first 3 years of this tree's life, it will get water every week in the growing season in summer. But from years 4 to 10, it should be established, and I'm going to let it establish itself where it is and not necessarily baby it along. There's mulching, staking, pruning schedules. So again, getting it in the ground is great, but the point I want to make is you equally have to take care of those trees if you want them to be that 60, 80, 100-year tree in your landscape, which so many of our sites have and what make them so special. And it's a challenge dealing with mature trees, and it's a challenge thinking of the future of these trees are really not for me, they're for my children or my children's children. But the saying I always heard is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. So when you think about your landscape, we definitely have the future in mind, and we want to take care of these beautiful landscapes. This is a picture of a grove of bald cypress, Taxodium distichum at Forest Lawn, that were planted in 1901, moved from the Pan American Exposition grounds to our site because the superintendent and our superintendent were friends, and the landscape there had to change. So you can see these today. Sadly, I don't have very many more examples of trees of that age and significance and story, but the hope is through our landscape renewal plan for these next 12 years, we're making ties to our community. We're encouraging people to plant their tree. We're telling them the GPS point. We're wanting them to follow up and make a connection to that tree. So as we move forward in 50, 100 years, people can come back and have a connection to that tree as well. I think that's all I have for now. I'll be happy to take questions.